She was 4 years old. She had a stuffed elephant named Blue that she carried by the trunk, a laugh that her mother described as too big for her body, and a habit of falling asleep in the car within 3 minutes of any trip, longer than a mile. On the evening of March 12, 1984, she was put to bed in her room in the town of Millhaven, Iowa, by her mother, who tucked the blanket around her, turned on the nightlight, shaped like a crescent moon, and went to watch the 10 o'clock news in the next room. When Carol Ward checked on Hannah at 11:30, the bed was empty, and the window was open 2 inches, and the crescent moon nightlight was still on, illuminating nothing. That is not a story about a custody dispute that got out of hand. That is a story about a man who made a deliberate choice, in the dark, to take a child from a sleeping house and drive her across a state line and build a false life on top of what he had done, and then spend the next 15 years teaching that child to love him, which she did. And when he died, when Hannah was 19 years old and standing at his graveside in rural Minnesota, believing her name was Megan Pruitt and that her mother had walked away from them both before she could form a memory, the secret died with him. Or so he believed. 41 years after that March night, a 78-year-old woman in Millhaven named Sylvia Crane made a phone call that she had been putting off for longer than most people wait for anything. Her husband had died 6 weeks before. The things she had been afraid to say while he was alive no longer had anything to protect. She dialed the number. She waited. When a deputy answered, she said, "I need to tell you something about the Ward girl. I saw something in 1984, and I never told anyone. I'm telling you now." What she told them broke open a case that had been cold since Ronald Reagan was running for his second term. But before we get to what Sylvia saw, we have to understand what Carol Ward lost, and what it cost a woman to carry the truth for 41 years, and why she waited, and what finally made her stop. Millhaven sat in central Iowa, about 40 miles northeast of Des Moines, a town of 4,000 built around a canning plant and a hardware co-op, and the particular civic pride of communities that have learned to take care of themselves because no one else is going to do it for them. In 1984, the farm crisis was grinding through Iowa like weather, slow, wide, and merciless, and the families who had been there for generations were doing the arithmetic on their land and coming up with numbers that didn't work. The town was holding on. Towns like Millhaven always hold on. But there was a tightness in it that year, a worry that sat behind everything else, and people felt it even if they didn't always say so. Carol Ward was 30 years old, a bookkeeper for a grain elevator on the east side of town. She was raising Hannah alone, had been since Hannah was 2, when the marriage to Dennis Pruitt ended the way it had been ending for a long time, badly and with lawyers. Dennis had wanted custody. The court had not agreed. He had visitation rights every other weekend, court-ordered and supervised, and he had exercised them, reliably, until January of 1984, when he began canceling. Carol had noted this to her attorney. She had been told it was not, by itself, actionable. She thought about that for a long time afterward. Dennis Pruitt was 34 in 1984, a long-haul trucker who had grown up in the eastern part of the state and had family in Minnesota, which nobody thought much about at the time. He was a large, physical man, not violent in any documented way, but with a temper that expressed itself in other forms: silence, disappearance, sudden reversal. He had told the family court mediator twice that he would not accept a situation where his daughter was kept from him. The mediator had noted this in her report. It had not changed the outcome. Hannah was everything Carol had not expected parenthood to be: loud, determined, tender in the specific way of children who feel things very completely. She was 4 years old that March, small for her age. with her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking something through. She had recently become interested in dinosaurs with the intensity only a 4-year-old can sustain, and she referred to a neighborhood cat named Buttons as her personal pet, regardless of whose cat it technically was. She called her grandmother on the telephone and held long, serious conversations about nothing in particular. She was, by every account of everyone who knew her, completely herself. Carol put her to bed at 8:30 on the night of March 12th. She kissed her forehead. She tucked Blue the elephant in beside her. She turned on the crescent moon nightlight and pulled the door to, not quite closed, the way Hannah liked it. By morning, she was gone. Carol found the empty bed at 6:47 a.m. She stood in the doorway. The nightlight was still on. Blue the elephant was still in the bed. Hannah never went anywhere without Blue. She called the Millhaven Police Department at 6:52. The first officer arrived at 7:19. Within 2 hours, there were 4 officers in the house and a detective named Roy Stillman asking Carol, with careful patience, to go through the evening again from the beginning. The window in Hannah's room had been raised 2 inches from the outside. There were no footprints in the frost on the ground below it. The overnight temperature had not been cold enough to preserve them. There were no signs of forced entry. Because no force had been needed, the window latch had been loose for 2 weeks. Something Carol had mentioned to a neighbor and intended to fix, and hadn't. She told Detective Stillman this, and the way she said it, flat, without the self-protective impulse to explain it away, was the thing he remembered most about that first morning. She already knew, somewhere beneath conscious thought, what this was. She told him about Dennis. Stillman drove to Dennis Pruitt's last known address, a rental on the south side of Millhaven, by 9 o'clock, empty. The landlord said he had moved out 3 weeks ago. Forwarding address unknown. His truck, a 1979 Kenworth, which he used for work, was not registered to any current employer. The trucking company he had last contracted with said he had stopped taking jobs in February. 3 weeks. He had been planning it for at least 3 weeks. By the afternoon of March 13th, a statewide missing child alert had been issued. Dennis Pruitt's name and photograph were circulated to law enforcement across Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. The FBI was notified and assigned an agent named Gerald Marsh to the case by March 15th. Agent Marsh interviewed Carol twice, interviewed the family court mediator, pulled Dennis's financial records, and established that Dennis had withdrawn $4,000 in cash from a savings account in late February. Cash. No trail. Dennis Pruitt had no active criminal record. He had no known associates in other states who might harbor a fugitive. He had family in Minnesota, an older brother named Carl, a cousin outside of Duluth, and both were interviewed and said they had not seen Dennis or heard from him. Neither of them appeared to be lying. Investigators could not prove they were. By the summer of 1984, the trail was cold. Dennis Pruitt and Hannah Ward had, as far as any database in 1984 could determine, ceased to exist. Carol Ward did not cease to exist. She went back to work at the grain elevator. She kept Hannah's room unchanged. She attended every meeting of the Iowa Missing Children's Network for 11 years, until the organization restructured and the meetings stopped. She spoke to Agent Marsh every 6 months for 4 years, and then once a year, and then as often as there was something new to say, which became less and less frequent. She never moved out of the house on Callaway Street. She told a neighbor once, without elaboration, that she needed to stay somewhere Hannah could find. The years did what years do. By 1989, 5 years had passed, Hannah would have been 9. Carol kept her school photograph, the last one taken the previous fall. Hannah in a red sweater, head tilted the way she did when she was thinking, in a frame on the mantelpiece. She did not update it with age progression images, though the FBI sent them twice. The age progression images showed a stranger. The photograph showed Hannah. By 1994, 10 years. Dennis Pruitt had not surfaced in any database, any arrest record, any government filing that investigators had access to. He had built something genuinely invisible, which in 1984, before the internet, before the interconnected record systems that exist today, was more possible than it sounds. He had taken a child to a place where no one was looking and stayed there. In 1997, Carol Ward received a letter from Agent Gerald Marsh, who was retiring. He told her the case was being transferred to a new agent. He told her he was sorry. He told her he had thought about Hannah's case more than she would probably believe. She kept the letter in the same drawer as Hannah's school photograph. By 2003, Dennis Pruitt had been dead for 4 years, though Carol would not know this for another 22 years. He died of a heart attack in the spring of 1999 on a farm outside of a small town in central Minnesota called Reedsvale, where he had been living as Robert Pruitt, his middle name, which was also his brother's middle name. A fact that had been sitting in a case file since 1984 without anyone understanding its significance. He died on a Tuesday in April. His daughter, who believed her name was Megan Pruitt and her mother had left before she could form a memory, was 19 years old. She stood at his graveside with neighbors who had known him for 15 years and mourned him as the man who had raised her alone and done the best he could. She was 23 when she married, 26 when her first daughter was born, 38 when she started wondering, for the first time in a sustained way, about the mother she had no memory of, not from grief, not from trauma, but from the ordinary human need that becomes more pressing when you become a parent yourself, to understand where you came from. She had searched, twice, without finding anything. The name her father had given her, the social security number he had obtained fraudulently when she was 5, the school records that had begun in Minnesota with no trail behind them, all of it was designed by a man who had planned carefully to be impossible to trace backward. She didn't know she was looking for herself. She thought she was looking for a woman named Patricia Pruitt, who had abandoned her family. There was no such woman. Every case on this channel is built from weeks of research, court records, case files, interviews with people who carry these stories for decades before anyone asks them to speak. If this work matters to you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We'll be right back with Hannah Ward. Sylvia Crane had been next-door neighbor to Carol Ward on Callaway Street in 1984. She was 37 that March, in a marriage to a man named Howard Crane that she would later describe to investigators as one she had been afraid to leave and more afraid to challenge. Howard had opinions about staying out of other people's business. He had made those opinions clear. And in the early morning hours of March 13, 1984, when Sylvia had been unable to sleep and had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water and had looked out the window above the sink, she had seen something she could not unsee. She had seen Dennis Pruitt's truck. She had seen him carry someone, from the side of Carol's house to the cab. She had seen the door close. She had seen the truck pull away east on Callaway Street at approximately 2:15 in the morning. She had stood at her kitchen window in the dark, holding her water glass, and she had known what she was looking at. And she had gone back to bed, and Howard had asked her in the morning if she'd heard anything, and she had said no. and she had said no every day for 41 years, to every person who might have asked. Howard Crane died in January of 2025. He had a stroke on a Wednesday evening and was gone by Thursday morning, and at his funeral Sylvia sat in the front pew and thought about Calloway Street in 1984, and a truck pulling away east and a little girl named Hannah Ward, whose photograph had been on a poster in the post office for years and years. 6 weeks later, she called the sheriff's department. The call came in on a Thursday morning in March 2025, 41 years, almost to the week, from the night Sylvia had stood at her kitchen window. The deputy who answered was 29 years old and had never heard of Hannah Ward. He took the information down carefully, escalated it within the hour, and by afternoon, a detective named Sergeant Lena Voigt had pulled the original case file and was on the phone with the Iowa DCI. Sylvia Crane sat across from Sergeant Voigt the following morning and described what she had seen. She described the truck. She described the time. She described Dennis Pruitt, whom she had known by sight as Carol's ex-husband, a man who had come and gone from that street for 2 years. She described carrying the glass of water back to the bedroom. She described what she had told Howard. "Why didn't you come forward?" Sergeant Voigt asked. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "Howard told me not to," she said. "And I was afraid of what he'd do if I did." She looked at her hands. And then it had been a year. And then it had been 5. And then it had been so long that I didn't know how to start. Sergeant Voigt thanked her and got to work. The truck registration tied Dennis Pruitt, through his brother Carl's name, which he had used on a single document in 1984, to a rural route address in Morrison County, Minnesota. Carl Pruitt, now 71, was interviewed within 48 hours. He had known. He had known from the beginning, had helped Dennis establish the farm, had kept the silence for 41 years, had told investigators in 1984 that he hadn't seen his brother, and had told himself, privately, that what Dennis had done was not his place to correct. He told Sergeant Voigt everything, now, in a single sitting, with the expression of a man setting down something that had been heavy for a very long time. The woman known as Megan Pruitt was located through a Minnesota motor vehicle record tied to the farm address. She was 45 years old. She was a dental hygienist in a town called Larkspur, 40 miles from where she had grown up. She had 2 daughters, aged 17 and 14. Sergeant Voigt made the call on a Tuesday afternoon. She asked to speak with Megan Pruitt. She identified herself. She said, as carefully as she knew how to say it, that she was calling about a cold case from Iowa, and that she believed Megan might be connected to it, and that she was going to explain what that meant, and that she needed Megan to stay on the line. There was a long silence. "How long have you known?" Megan said finally. "We just found you," Voigt said. Another silence. "I think," Megan said slowly, "I think I've been waiting for this call for a long time. I didn't know what I was waiting for. But I think it was this. Dennis Pruitt could not be prosecuted. He had been dead for 26 years. What the state of Iowa produced instead was a formal finding of parental kidnapping, a federal determination, and the permanent attachment of his name to what he had done. Carl Pruitt pleaded guilty to a charge of accessory and received a suspended sentence, given his age and cooperation. These are not satisfying outcomes in the way that a trial is a satisfying outcome. They do not look like justice, as most people picture it. But here is what also happened. Carol Ward was 71 years old when Sergeant Voigt came to Calloway Street for the second time in 4 decades. She was still in the same house. Hannah's photograph was still on the mantelpiece. When Voigt told her what the investigation had found, Carol sat very still. the way she had sat in that first morning in 1984. And then she put her hand over her mouth and held it there. "Is she all right?" she said. That question, it turns out, is the first thing every mother says. The first phone call between Carol Ward and the woman who had been raised as Megan Pruitt lasted 47 minutes. What was said in that call belongs to them. What has been shared through the family's advocate is this: that Megan, who is still working through what name she wants to use, and who deserves every second of time that process takes, told her mother that she remembered the crescent moon nightlight. Not as a story, not from a photograph. She just remembered it. The shape of it. The color of the light it made. She was 4 years old when it was taken from her. She had carried that small warm light for 41 years without knowing what it was. A case like this one does not resolve cleanly. It asks more of everyone involved than a clean resolution would require. Carol Ward spent 41 years being wronged by a man who, by most accounts of the people who knew him in Minnesota, was also a devoted father. Dennis Pruitt built rockets with the Science Club. He coached Little League. He was at every school play and every parent-teacher conference and every ordinary moment of his daughter's life that he had stolen the right to be present for. He loved Megan, the daughter he had renamed, the life he had constructed, and that love was real, and it was built entirely on a theft. How do you hold both of those things? How does the woman who grew up as his daughter hold both of those things? There is no framework for this. There is only the work of it, which Megan is doing, which Carol is doing, which 2 teenage girls in Minnesota are doing, because their mother came home one day and told them that the story of where they came from was not the story they had been given. Sylvia Crane is 78 years old. She has not been charged with any crime. What she carries now is a different kind of weight than the one she put down. Not guilt exactly, but an accounting. She told investigators she was sorry. She said she knew it didn't fix anything. She was right that it doesn't. She was also right that saying it, after 41 years, was the only thing left she could do. What do you think justice looks like in a case where the person responsible is already gone, and where the person who took the child also loved her? That question doesn't have an easy answer, and I think it's worth sitting with. And what about Sylvia? Do you believe that fear is sufficient explanation for 41 years of silence? Or does the fact that she eventually came forward matter? Leave your thoughts below. Hannah Ward remembered a crescent moon nightlight from 41 years ago. She didn't know what the memory was. She was carrying it home the whole time. That is why this channel exists, because the truth survives in the most unexpected places, and it is always worth looking for. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are in the description below. Thank you for being here.